Hey guys, tonight we're settling into something soft and sun-warmed. The early days of being a newlywed in 1970 America. That particular quiet that settles over a brand new apartment when the boxes are only half unpacked and the good dishes are still wrapped in newspaper. That feeling of being handed a whole life to build, together, with nothing but a marriage license, a few wedding gifts, and a lot of hope. Before we get into it, thank you truly to the viewer who suggested this one. You always seem to know exactly the kind of evening I need to write, and this topic has been sitting warm in my mind ever since you sent it over. If you are new here, I would love it if you considered liking the video and subscribing, only if it genuinely feels right to you, and if you have a memory of your own early married days, I always love reading those in the comments. And a small quiet note. This channel is also on Spotify now, so if you would rather drift off to sleep with just the sound and no screen, you can find it there through the link in the description. Now go ahead and get yourself settled. Dim the lights, switch on a fan if you have one, just for that soft hum in the background. Pull the blanket up, let your shoulders drop. Because tonight we're stepping into a world where a wedding ring was still new enough to catch the light strangely on your hand. What did it actually feel like to wake up in your very first apartment, one you chose together, with furniture that did not quite match yet? What did the inside of a brand new set of matching towels smell like, still stiff from the store? What did Sunday mornings become once there were two of you instead of one? What did it feel like to sign your first joint bank statement, or answer the phone and say we instead of I for the first time? What did the hum of a record player sound like in a living room that was still figuring out where the couch should go? And just like that, it is 1970. The rings are still new. The boxes in the corner of the living room have not quite been unpacked. Someone down the hall is running water for a bath. And the first quiet evening of your whole married life is just beginning. Let's start with the morning after. You wake up in a bed that is somehow the same bed and an entirely different life. The sheets are new, a wedding gift from someone's aunt still holding that faint store-bought stiffness that has not yet softened into something familiar. Sunlight comes in through curtains you have not chosen yet, borrowed ones, temporary ones, and for a moment you forget where you are. Then you remember, you're married. The word still feels large in your mouth, larger than the ring on your hand, larger than the small apartment around you. You lie still for a moment, just breathing, listening to the quiet hum of a radiator somewhere in the wall, the distant sound of a car passing on the street below. Beside you, your husband stirs, still half asleep, one arm draped across the extra pillow as though even in sleep he is reaching for something solid to hold on to. You watch him for a moment, the way his chest rises and falls, the way his hair falls slightly across his forehead, and you feel something settle in your stomach that is part joy and part disbelief. This is your life now. Not a borrowed evening, not a date that will end with a goodnight kiss on someone else's porch, but an entire life, stretching out in front of you like a road you cannot yet see the end of. The room smells faintly of new paint and cardboard, the boxes stacked along one wall still sealed with tape, waiting to be opened. There's a suitcase half unpacked in the corner, your good dress from the reception draped carefully over a chair, still smelling faintly of champagne and cigarette smoke from last night's celebration. You notice small things you have never had to notice before, the exact placement of his shoes by the door, the unfamiliar toothbrush now sitting beside yours in a cup on the bathroom sink, 2 toothbrushes where there used to be one. It is such a small detail, and yet it feels enormous, this quiet proof that your life has merged with someone else's. You slip out of bed carefully, trying not to wake him, and pad across the cool floor in your bare feet. The apartment is small, still unfamiliar in the way a new pair of shoes is unfamiliar, not uncomfortable exactly, just not yet broken in. You find the kitchen and stand there for a moment, unsure where anything is kept, laughing quietly to yourself at the strangeness of not knowing your own kitchen yet. There is a coffee pot still in its box, another wedding gift, and you decide this will be the first thing you unpack. Something about making coffee in your own kitchen on your first morning as a married woman feels important in a way you cannot quite explain. While the coffee begins to percolate, filling the small space with a rich, dark smell, you look around at the apartment that is now yours. The walls are bare, waiting for photographs you have not yet had developed. The furniture is a strange assortment of pieces from both your families, a couch from his parents' basement, a lamp from your childhood bedroom, none of it matching yet, all of it waiting to become something cohesive. It occurs to you that this is what marriage looks like in its very first hours, not a finished picture, but pieces gathered together, waiting patiently to become a home. Your husband wanders into the kitchen a few minutes later, still in his undershirt, hair mussed from sleep, and wraps his arms around you from behind as you pour the coffee. Neither of you says much. There is no need to. The silence between you feels different than it used to, less like the silence of two people who do not know what to say, and more like the silence of two people who no longer need to fill every quiet moment with words. You lean back against him for a moment, coffee cup warm in your hands, and watch the morning light move slowly across the kitchen floor. Outside, the neighborhood is just beginning to stir. Someone's car door closing, a dog barking somewhere down the block, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning in 1970, and yet nothing about this morning feels ordinary to you. It is the kind of morning people spend their whole lives waiting for without quite knowing it. The first morning of an entirely new chapter, the sheet still stiff, the coffee pot still unfamiliar, the whole apartment holding its breath along with you. You will not remember, years from now, exactly what you said to each other that first morning, or what you had for breakfast, or which box you opened first. But you will remember this feeling, this particular blend of nervousness and certainty, the sense of stepping into something both entirely new and exactly right. It is a feeling that modern life, with its rushed courthouse weddings and immediate return to routine, rarely allows itself to sit inside anymore. But here, in this small kitchen, on this ordinary Tuesday morning, you let yourself have it fully. Eventually you will shower, dress, begin the long work of turning boxes into a home. But for now, you simply stand together in the kitchen, coffee cooling slightly in your cups, sunlight creeping across the floor, married and still slightly amazed by the word. It is midweek now, and the living room floor is covered in cardboard boxes, each one wrapped in brown paper and string, each one a small mystery from someone who loves you. You kneel on the carpet together, prying open boxes to find casserole dishes, matching towels, a toaster still in its factory plastic. Every gift feels like a small vote of confidence, as if the people who gave them are quietly saying, "We believe this will last." The afternoon light slants low through the window, catching the dust motes that rise every time you tear open another box. There is a particular sound to this work, the scratch of scissors through tape, the crinkle of tissue paper being pulled aside, the soft thud of a wrapped dish being set carefully on the carpet. You work slowly, savouring it, because each box feels like a small excavation into the lives of the people who love you. An aunt's careful handwriting on a gift tag, a college friend's slightly crooked bow, a grandmother's insistence on wrapping even the simplest gift as though it were something precious. Your husband holds up a gravy boat with genuine confusion, turning it over in his hands as though trying to solve a puzzle. Neither of you has ever used one, and for a moment you both simply look at it, laughing at the strange formality of an object neither of you knows quite what to do with yet, It goes into a cupboard anyway, tucked behind the everyday plates, waiting patiently for a holiday dinner sometime down the road, when you will finally understand its purpose. There is a rhythm to unpacking a life together, unhurried, occasionally interrupted by a memory. A set of towels reminds him of his mother's linen closet. A mixing bowl reminds you of standing beside your own mother in a kitchen years ago, learning to fold batter the right way. Every object seems to carry two histories now, his and yours, merging quietly into something shared. You find yourselves narrating small stories to each other as you unpack, filling in gaps neither of you knew existed, learning the shape of each other's childhoods through the objects that survived them. Some gifts feel entirely practical: sheets, dish towels, a toaster that gleams under the window light, its chrome surface catching your reflection distorted and small. Others feel almost sentimental before they have even been used: a set of wine glasses from an old family friend, a serving tray engraved with your new shared initials, a small clock that ticks steadily from its spot on the mantel, marking the passage of your first days together in this apartment. By late afternoon, the boxes have multiplied into piles, wrapping paper gathered in a growing heap by the door, ribbon curling across the carpet like something left over from the wedding itself. You take a break to make tea, standing together in the small kitchen amid half-unpacked shelves, surveying the chaos with a kind of tired satisfaction. It does not look like a finished home yet. It looks like the beginning of one, which somehow feels even better. There is something quietly moving about receiving so many gifts meant not for you individually, but for the two of you together as a unit that did not exist a few weeks ago. Every casserole dish assumes a future dinner party. Every set of towels assumes years of ordinary mornings. The gifts themselves seem to hold a kind of faith in your marriage that you're only beginning to hold in yourselves. A quiet, practical faith expressed not in words but in kitchenware and linens. As evening falls, you finally break for dinner, sitting cross-legged on the floor amid the debris of wrapping paper, eating sandwiches off paper plates because the real plates are still being washed in the sink. It strikes you, in this unglamorous, half-finished moment, surrounded by open boxes and crumpled paper, that this is what building a home actually looks like. Not a magazine photograph of a finished living room, but two people patiently working through boxes together, laughing over gravy boats, remembering their mothers, slowly turning gifts into the ordinary architecture of a shared life. By the time you finally climb into bed that night, the living room is only half organised, more boxes waiting for tomorrow. But something has shifted. The apartment feels a little more like yours now, a little less like a temporary stop and a little more like the beginning of something lasting. You fall asleep to the faint ticking of the new mantel clock somewhere down the hall, a small steady sound that will soon become so familiar you will stop noticing it altogether, the way all the sounds of a home eventually become part of its quiet, comforting background hum. Let's move to the kitchen now, where a single piece of notepaper sits on the counter, half filled with handwriting that is not quite yours and not quite theirs, but something new, blended together. Milk, eggs, coffee. The list feels almost sacred, this small proof that you're now buying food for two mouths, two appetites, two sets of habits that are only beginning to merge into one shared rhythm. You stand at the counter with a pencil, adding to the list slowly, thinking not just of what you need but of what he likes, a habit you're only beginning to build. He prefers his coffee strong, almost bitter, while you have always liked yours lighter, more cream than coffee. You add both kinds to the list, smiling faintly at the small compromise of it, two different jars of coffee sharing the same cupboard shelf. It occurs to you that grocery shopping, something you have done alone for years, has quietly become an act of consideration, a small daily negotiation between two sets of preferences. The list grows longer as the morning goes on. Bread, butter, a chicken for Sunday dinner, the brand of cigarettes he prefers, a particular kind of soap you both agreed on after trying several. Each item feels less like a chore and more like a small act of care, proof that you are paying attention to someone else's life in a way you never had to before. You find yourself remembering things he mentioned in passing days ago, an offhand comment about missing a certain brand of crackers from home, and you add it to the list without him even asking. By mid-morning you gather your coat and pocketbook, list folded carefully in your hand, and walk the few blocks to the corner grocery. The store is humming with its usual midweek quiet. A few other women moving slowly between shelves, baskets over their arms, the low murmur of conversation near the register. You feel strangely self-conscious walking in, as though your new status as a married woman is somehow visible, stitched invisibly into your coat. Perhaps it is only in your imagination, but the grocer greets you with a particular warmth, and you wonder if news of the wedding has already made its way through the neighborhood grapevine. You move through the aisles slowly, checking items off the list with genuine pleasure, a satisfaction that surprises you. There is something deeply grounding about this ordinary task, choosing a chicken for Sunday dinner, deciding between two brands of butter, picking out a loaf of bread that smells warm and yeasty, even through its paper wrapping. It does not feel like drudgery. It feels like the quiet architecture of a life you're only just beginning to build, one grocery list at a time. At the register, the total comes to more than you expected, and you feel a small jolt of new responsibility, the awareness that this money now comes from a shared pool rather than your own paycheck alone. You count out the bills carefully, aware in a new way of what things cost, aware that every dollar spent here is a dollar the two of you have decided, together, to spend. It is a small moment, easily overlooked, but it carries within it an entire education in what it means to build a household with someone else. Walking home, bag balanced against your hip, you think about the list still folded in your coat pocket, half in your handwriting, half in his, added to over several days as you both remember things you needed. It strikes you that this ordinary scrap of paper is, in its own small way, a kind of love letter, an accumulation of small considerations, each item a quiet acknowledgement that someone else's needs now matter as much as your own. That evening you unpack the groceries together, laughing over the ridiculous amount of coffee now crowding the cupboard. Two different kinds sitting side by side like an unspoken compromise. You cook dinner using ingredients chosen with someone else in mind for the first time in your life, and something about the simple chicken roasting in the oven, filling the apartment with its warm, familiar smell, feels like an accomplishment far larger than its size. It is such a small thing, a grocery list, and yet it holds within it the entire quiet beginning of a shared life. It is early evening, and you are noticing things you never noticed before, the way they leave the cap off the toothpaste, the exact temperature they like their coffee, the particular sigh they let out when a favourite record ends. Marriage, you are learning, is not one grand discovery but hundreds of small ones, quietly collected over the first weeks like pressed flowers in a book. You sit curled on the couch with a book you're not really reading, watching him from the corner of your eye as he moves through the apartment, straightening a stack of newspapers, adjusting the volume on the radio just slightly, humming a tune under his breath that you're beginning to recognize as something he does whenever he is content. You never noticed these small habits during your courtship, when every evening together was an event carefully planned, carefully dressed for. Now, in the unremarkable quiet of an ordinary Tuesday, his habits reveal themselves slowly, unguarded, like something private being gently offered. You're learning things about yourself too, habits you never noticed until someone else was there to observe them. You discover you hum while you cook, a habit your mother apparently shares, one you never realized you'd inherited until he pointed it out with a fond, teasing smile. You discover you like the windows open even in cooler weather, something he tolerates with a slight shiver and a blanket pulled a little higher. These small discoveries feel oddly vulnerable, the quiet exposure of habits formed over a lifetime of living alone, now suddenly visible to someone else's careful attention. Dinner dishes drying in the rack become a small site of negotiation. You prefer them stacked one way, he prefers another, and you find yourselves quietly working out a compromise without ever quite discussing it directly, simply adjusting, watching, adapting. There is no manual for this kind of thing, no guidebook explaining how two separate sets of habits slowly merge into something workable. It happens instead through small trial and error, a quiet, wordless negotiation carried out one evening at a time. You notice too the way he handles frustration, a long exhale through his nose rather than raised words, a habit that tells you something true about his temperament before you've even had your first real argument. He notices, in turn, the way you go quiet when you're working through a worry rather than voicing it immediately, learning slowly that your silence is not distance but concentration. These observations feel like small gifts you're giving each other, unspoken permission to be fully seen in your ordinary, unglamorous humanity. The evening deepens, the radio humming low, dishes finally dried and put away. You find yourselves settling into a rhythm already, an unspoken choreography of who washes and who dries, who turns off which lights before bed, who checks that the door is locked. None of this was discussed explicitly. It has simply accumulated day by day, the quiet architecture of two lives slowly becoming a shared one. There is something deeply tender about this early stage of marriage, before habits have fully calcified into routine, when every small discovery still carries a small thrill of intimacy. You are learning a person in the truest sense, not through grand gestures or important conversations, but through toothpaste caps and coffee temperatures, and the particular sigh someone makes when a favourite song ends. It is a slower, quieter kind of knowing than modern life often makes room for, but it is perhaps the truest kind there is. As you climb into bed that night, you find yourself already anticipating small things, the way he will reach for the lamp switch a beat before you do, the way he will pull the blanket slightly toward his side before settling. These are not grand romantic gestures. They are simply the ordinary texture of a life being built together, one small habit at a time, and there is a particular kind of comfort in that. The comfort of being known, slowly and completely, in all your smallest, most unremarkable ways. The apartment is small, maybe smaller than either of you expected, but it is yours. Let's picture it together. Mismatched furniture from two different households, a couch from her parents', a lamp from his old room, all of it arranged and rearranged until it finally feels less like two lives pushed together and more like one life beginning. You spend the better part of a Saturday afternoon shifting furniture from one wall to another, standing back to assess, shifting it again. The couch, a slightly worn but sturdy piece from your parents' den, seems too large for the living room no matter where you place it, while his old reading lamp casts a warm, uneven light that neither of you can decide belongs in the corner or beside the window. There is a comedy to this process. Both of you offering opinions, neither quite willing to admit defeat, until finally you collapse onto the mismatched couch together, laughing at the sheer domestic absurdity of arguing over furniture placement like seasoned homeowners. The kitchen presents its own puzzle, pots and pans from two different mothers, none of them quite matching, stacked into cupboards that were clearly designed for a more organised system than the one you're attempting. You find yourselves debating, half seriously, half in jest, whose method of stacking dishes is correct, whose way of organising spices makes more sense. These arguments carry no real weight. They're simply the early comedy of two households merging into one, each of you bringing your own small systems and slowly discovering which ones will survive the merger and which will quietly be abandoned. The bedroom takes shape more easily. A dresser from his childhood home pushed against one wall, a vanity your mother insisted you take standing opposite it, both pieces slightly worn but sturdy, carrying within them decades of previous use. You place your wedding photograph on the dresser, still slightly overwhelmed by how recent and how permanent it feels, a formal image of the two of you standing together, already beginning to look like it belongs there, as though it had always been part of this room. By late afternoon, boxes have been broken down and stacked by the door. Furniture has found something resembling its final position, and the apartment, while still clearly a work in progress, has begun to feel less like a temporary stop and more like an actual home. You stand together in the doorway of the living room, surveying your work with the particular satisfaction of two people who have spent an entire day building something, however small, together. There is a modern tendency, decades from now, to furnish an entire home in a single weekend trip to a store, everything matching, everything purchased new and coordinated. But there is something in this slower, more patchwork approach that feels truer somehow. A couch that carries the memory of your childhood evenings, a lamp that once lit his solitary studying, brought together now under one roof, slowly becoming something new. The apartment does not look like a magazine photograph. It looks like two lives, honestly and visibly merging. As evening falls, you make dinner using the mismatched pots, eat at a small table that wobbles slightly on uneven legs, and talk about what still needs to be done: curtains for the bedroom, a rug for the cold living room floor, a proper set of dishes eventually. But none of these unfinished tasks feel urgent tonight. There is a particular pleasure in watching a home slowly take shape, rather than appearing instantly finished. The satisfaction of knowing that every piece of furniture, every small adjustment, was chosen and placed by the two of you together. Later, lying in bed in the room that is finally beginning to feel like yours, you look up at the ceiling and think about how strange it is that a life can be built from such ordinary pieces: borrowed furniture, mismatched dishes, wedding gifts still waiting to be unpacked. And yet somehow, piece by piece, it is becoming something whole, something that belongs entirely to the two of you, in all its imperfect patchwork beauty. Sunday mornings take on a different shape now. It is quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel lonely and now feels shared. Coffee percolates on the stove, filling the apartment with a smell that seems to belong to no one and everyone at once. You sit across from each other at a small table, still in pyjamas, in no particular hurry to become anyone else today. There is no alarm clock demanding attention this morning, no schedule pulling either of you toward the day ahead. Sunlight moves slowly across the kitchen table, catching the steam rising from your coffee cups, illuminating small dust motes drifting lazily through the air. You find yourselves talking about nothing in particular, small observations about the neighbourhood, a memory from childhood, an idle plan for later in the day that neither of you feels any real urgency to act upon. This unhurried quality to the conversation feels entirely new, a luxury neither of you quite anticipated when you imagined married life. The newspaper sits folded between you, sections divided without discussion, an unspoken system already established after just a few Sundays together. He reads the sports section first, always, while you prefer the local news, occasionally reading a particularly interesting item aloud, prompting a small exchange before you both return to your respective sections in comfortable silence. This division of the newspaper feels like such a small thing, and yet it carries within it an entire quiet choreography of how two people learn to share a single morning without either feeling crowded. Outside, the neighbourhood moves through its own slow Sunday rhythm. Church bells somewhere in the distance, a neighbour's car pulling out of the driveway, someone's radio playing faintly through an open window down the block. You're both aware, in a soft, unspoken way, that this particular kind of quiet, unstructured morning is somewhat rare, a small pocket of stillness carved out of an otherwise demanding week. There is something almost sacred about it, this permission to simply exist together without obligation, without performance, without anywhere else to be. Eventually the coffee pot runs empty, and one of you rises to refill it. The movement so natural now it requires no discussion. You have already, in these few short weeks, developed a kind of wordless system, who refills the coffee, who clears the table, who wipes the counter afterward. None of this was negotiated explicitly. It simply emerged, the quiet accumulation of two people learning to move through shared space without stepping on each other's routines. By mid-morning you might finally dress, though there is no real urgency to it. Perhaps a walk around the block, perhaps nothing more ambitious than moving from the kitchen table to the living room couch, where the record player hums quietly in the background. This kind of morning, unstructured and slow, feels like a small luxury that modern life, decades later, with its constant motion and endless obligation, will rarely allow itself. There is something almost radical in retrospect about two people simply sitting together with nowhere to be. You find yourself thinking, as the morning stretches lazily into early afternoon, about all the Sunday mornings that will follow this one, decades of them stretching ahead, some quiet like this one, some filled with children's noise, some heavy with worry, some light with celebration. But this particular Sunday, the first one of your married life together, carries its own quiet significance, a template being set for how the two of you will choose to move through unstructured time together. As the coffee cups empty and the newspaper grows soft with handling, you glance across the table at your husband, still in his pyjamas, hair slightly mussed, utterly at ease, and feel a small wave of gratitude for this particular ordinary morning. It is nothing remarkable by any objective measure, just coffee and newspaper and quiet conversation, and yet it feels somehow like exactly the kind of morning you will remember fondly for years to come, precisely because nothing remarkable happened at all. Let's go to a different kind of Sunday now. The kind that involves a car ride and a covered dish balanced carefully on your lap. Meeting your new in-laws as a married couple feels different than it did as someone dating their child. There is a new title now, son-in-law or daughter-in-law, and with it, a new set of expectations, spoken and unspoken, that you are only beginning to learn. The drive to his parents' house feels longer than it actually is. Both of you a little quieter than usual. The covered dish, a casserole you spent the better part of the morning preparing, warm against your knees. You had made this same dish before, during your courtship, but tonight it feels different, weighted with new significance, an offering not just to a boyfriend's family, but to your husband's parents, people who are now, in some formal and slightly unfamiliar way, your own family too. The house looks the same as it always has, the same porch light, the same slightly crooked mailbox, but walking up to the door tonight carries a different feeling entirely. His mother greets you at the door with a warmth that feels genuine, but also, you sense, slightly evaluative, a mother assessing how her son's new wife is settling into her role. You hand over the casserole with a small practiced smile, hoping it is good enough, hoping you are good enough, aware in a way you were not before the wedding that you are now being measured against some invisible standard of a good wife. Dinner unfolds around a table crowded with dishes, his mother's pot roast, his sister's contribution of rolls, your own casserole occupying a place of honour near the centre. Conversation moves easily at first, questions about the apartment, gentle teasing about newlywed life, his father making the same joke he has apparently made at every family gathering for years, one that still earns a genuine laugh from everyone at the table despite its familiarity. You're learning in real time the particular rhythms of this family, which jokes are beloved traditions, which topics to avoid, which relative requires careful diplomatic handling. There is a small private moment when his mother catches your eye across the table and gives you a brief, warm smile, and you feel something settle in your chest, a small but real sense of acceptance. It is not nothing, being welcomed into a family that is not your own by birth. It requires a kind of patient effort, learning names and habits and stories that predate you entirely, finding your footing in traditions that have existed for decades before you arrived. After dinner, the women move toward the kitchen out of long habit, clearing dishes, wrapping leftovers, engaging in a particular kind of conversation that happens easily over running water and clinking dishes, conversation that feels less formal than what happened at the table, more honest somehow. His mother asks about your own family, your own mother's recipes, small questions that feel less like an interview now and more like genuine curiosity, the beginning of what might, given enough Sundays like this one, eventually become real affection. Meanwhile, in the other room, your husband sits with his father, the particular easy silence of men who do not need constant conversation to feel comfortable together, punctuated occasionally by a comment about work or the weather, or a ball game playing quietly on the radio. You catch a glimpse of them through the kitchen doorway and feel a small, unexpected wave of tenderness, watching your husband in this older, more familiar version of himself, the son he has always been long before he became your husband. By the time you finally leave, the covered dish now empty, wrapped leftovers balanced on your lap for the ride home, you feel pleasantly tired in the particular way that comes from being carefully, gently evaluated and apparently approved of. The car ride home feels lighter than the drive there, both of you talking more freely now, comparing notes on the evening, laughing over his father's familiar jokes, feeling for the first time like a united team navigating a family gathering together rather than separate guests. You will have many more Sunday dinners like this one in the years ahead, some easier than tonight, some more complicated. But this first one carries its own quiet weight, the beginning of your slow, patient integration into a family that loved your husband long before you arrived, and is now, gradually, generously, learning to make room for you too. It is the first of the month, and there is a notepad on the kitchen table covered in numbers: rent, electric, groceries. The two of you sit shoulder to shoulder, dividing a paycheck into small, careful piles, some imagined, some very real, learning together what it means to build a life on a budget that has to stretch further than either of you managed alone. The kitchen light hangs low over the table, casting a warm circle around the notepad where columns of figures are slowly taking shape. His handwriting is quick and slightly slanted, yours more careful and rounded, and the page itself becomes a small artifact of collaboration, two different penmanships working out the same practical problem together. You have never had to account for someone else's expenses before, never had to weigh his need for new work shoes against your own want of a new winter coat, and the negotiation, while entirely practical, carries within it something almost intimate, the quiet revealing of what each of you values and what each of you is willing to sacrifice. Rent comes first, the largest figure on the page, circled twice as though circling it might somehow make it smaller. Then electric, then the telephone bill, then a rough estimate for groceries based on the past few weeks of shopping. You find yourselves rounding certain numbers up just slightly, a small cushion against the unexpected, both of you already developing an instinct for caution that neither of you had needed quite so urgently when you were managing only your own individual expenses. There is a brief, gentle disagreement over how much to allocate towards savings versus how much to leave available for small pleasures, a movie now and then, a nicer cut of meat for Sunday dinner. Neither of you raises your voice, but there is a genuine difference in temperament revealing itself here. His instinct toward caution, careful saving for some larger future goal, against your instinct towards small, immediate comforts that make the week feel worth the effort. You settle somewhere in the middle, a compromise neither of you is fully satisfied with, but both of you can live with, which perhaps describes most of marriage in miniature. The notepad fills slowly with categories, each one representing some small piece of the life you're building together. A modest sum set aside for his cigarettes, a modest sum for your occasional trip to the beauty parlour, a slightly larger sum earmarked, almost reverently, for a savings account meant eventually for a house of your own, a real house, with a yard and rooms enough for children someday. This last figure feels the most significant, small as it currently is, a physical representation of a future you're only beginning to imagine together. By the time the budget is finished, the kitchen table is scattered with crossed-out figures and small arithmetic corrections, evidence of the trial and error required to make two incomes and countless expenses fit neatly onto a single sheet of paper. You look over the final version together, and there is a quiet satisfaction in it, not because the numbers are generous, they are not, but because you have built something practical and honest together, a shared understanding of exactly what your life currently affords and what it will take, patiently, to afford more. This kind of unglamorous, practical planning rarely makes it into anyone's romantic memory of young married life, overshadowed by more sentimental moments, but it carries its own quiet intimacy nonetheless. There is something deeply trusting about revealing your exact financial anxieties to another person, admitting how little cushion exists between your income and your expenses, and choosing, together, to face that reality honestly rather than separately. As you fold the notepad closed for the evening, tucking it into a kitchen drawer where it will be pulled out again next month, and the month after that for years of first-of-the-month conversations to come, you feel a small, unglamorous, but genuine pride. This is what building a life together actually looks like, not grand romantic gestures, but careful columns of figures, honest conversation about limitations, and a shared, quiet determination to make it work, one modest paycheck at a time. Let's slow down here, because this moment matters too. It is evening, and voices have risen slightly over something small, whose turn it was to do the dishes, or a comment taken the wrong way. It is the first real disagreement of your marriage, and it feels enormous in the moment, though you do not yet know that these small storms will become as familiar and passing as summer rain. The kitchen feels smaller than usual, the air between you tighter, charged with something neither of you quite intended to create. It started so simply, an offhand comment about the dishes still sitting in the sink from lunch, a slightly sharper tone than either of you meant, and suddenly you're standing on opposite sides of the small kitchen, both slightly stunned by how quickly an ordinary evening turned into something else entirely. Neither of you is shouting, not really, but there is a tightness in both your voices that neither of you has heard from the other before. You feel your heart beating a little faster than it should for such a small disagreement, aware in some distant part of your mind that this argument, while it feels significant right now, is really about something smaller than either of you is admitting. Tiredness, perhaps, or the accumulated small stresses of building an entirely new life together in just a few short weeks. But in the moment, none of that context matters. All that matters is the sharp, uncomfortable silence that follows his last comment, the way you both stand there, unsure how to move forward from this particular unfamiliar territory. He turns toward the window, arms crossed, jaw tight, while you busy yourself with the dishes you were originally arguing about, scrubbing perhaps a little harder than necessary, the clatter of plates filling the silence neither of you knows how to break. This is new for both of you, this particular kind of tension, different from any disagreement you had during your courtship, when either of you could simply leave, return to your own separate homes, and let the discomfort dissolve overnight. Now there is nowhere to retreat to. You're both still here, in this same small kitchen, in this same small apartment, and the argument cannot simply be walked away from the way it once could have been. Minutes pass, feeling far longer than they actually are. You find yourself replaying the conversation, half convinced you were right, half wondering if you overreacted. The particular internal argument that follows any real disagreement, the mind working through blame and justification simultaneously. He remains by the window, quiet, and you wonder what he's thinking, whether he is as uncertain as you are about how exactly one moves forward from this kind of moment when there is no precedent yet established for how your particular marriage handles conflict. Eventually it is he who breaks the silence, his voice softer now, an admission that perhaps his comment came out harsher than he intended, that he had a difficult day and let it spill over onto something small and unimportant. You feel something in your chest loosen slightly at this admission, and you offer your own quiet acknowledgement, that perhaps you were more tired and short-tempered than the dishes themselves warranted. Neither apology is elaborate, neither needs to be. Something in the simple, honest admission from both of you begins to dissolve the tension that filled the kitchen just minutes before. You will learn, in the months and years ahead, that this pattern, sharp words followed by quiet reflection, followed by honest, unglamorous apology, will repeat itself many times throughout your marriage, over dishes and budgets and 100 other small forgettable disagreements. But tonight, in this particular moment, it feels unprecedented, frightening in its newness, the first real evidence that marriage will require not just love, but the harder, less romantic work of learning to disagree without breaking something important between you. By the time you finish the dishes, the kitchen quiet again, the argument already beginning to feel smaller in retrospect than it did in its middle. You glance at each other with a kind of tentative, exhausted tenderness. Neither of you says much more about it tonight. There will be time later, perhaps, to talk more fully about what triggered such a small disagreement to escalate so quickly. But for now, it is enough simply to stand together in the quiet kitchen, the storm past, the ordinary evening slowly reasserting itself around you. Let's sit with what comes after. The apartment is quiet again, the argument settled into something softer, an apology offered, a hand reached across the couch. You are learning together that marriage is not the absence of conflict, but the practice of returning to each other afterward, again and again, a little more gently each time. You sit at opposite ends of the couch at first, the aftermath of the argument still lingering faintly in the room, like the smell of something burnt. Not gone entirely, but fading slowly. The radio plays quietly in the background, filling the silence with something other than tension, and gradually, without either of you quite deciding to, the distance between you on the couch begins to close, an inch at a time, until eventually his hand finds yours resting on the cushion between you. Neither of you says much at first. There is a comfort in simply sitting together again, no longer separated by the argument's residual chill, the physical closeness itself a kind of unspoken apology, an acknowledgement that whatever was said earlier it does not outweigh the larger, steadier fact of choosing each other. You lean your head against his shoulder and he shifts slightly to accommodate you. And something in this small physical adjustment feels more meaningful than any words either of you could offer right now. Eventually, conversation returns, tentative at first, small observations about the radio program playing, gradually easing back into the comfortable rhythm you had before the argument interrupted it. You do not fully rehash what was said earlier, not tonight. There will be time for that. Perhaps tomorrow, when both of you have had more distance from it. Tonight is simply about returning to each other, re-establishing the closeness that felt briefly, frighteningly absent just an hour before. He mentions quietly that he does not like how the evening went, and you agree, admitting that neither of you handled the disagreement particularly well, both too tired, too quick to snap over something ultimately unimportant. This shared admission, offered without defensiveness from either of you, feels like real progress, evidence that you're both willing to take responsibility rather than simply waiting for the other to apologize first. You think, sitting here in the quiet living room, about all the small disagreements that likely lie ahead in your marriage, disagreements over money, over family, over 1,000 small daily decisions that two people must somehow navigate together. Tonight's argument, small as it was, has taught you something valuable, that the disagreement itself is far less important than what happens afterward. This quiet, deliberate choice to return to each other, to close the distance, to remember that you chose this life together precisely because you wanted to build it side by side, imperfections and all. The evening softens further as you make tea together in the small kitchen, moving around each other with the easy, practiced rhythm that had felt so disrupted just an hour earlier. There is something almost tender about this return to ordinary domestic routine, the kettle whistling softly, 2 cups set out on the counter, the particular comfort of familiar tasks after emotional turbulence. You find yourselves talking more easily now, laughing gently over something unrelated to the earlier disagreement, the tension fully dissolved into something warmer. By the time you climb into bed together that night, the argument feels like something from days ago rather than mere hours, already softening into the kind of memory that will eventually become almost fond, an early lesson in how to fight fairly, how to apologize honestly, how to choose reconciliation over prolonged distance. You settle against him, his arm finding its familiar place around you, and feel a quiet gratitude for this particular resolution, not perfect, not without its lingering small awkwardness, but genuine and complete enough to let you both fall asleep at peace. Marriage, you're learning already in these first few weeks, is built less from the absence of conflict and more from this precise, unglamorous practice. Disagreement followed by honest reckoning followed by deliberate return. It is not the romantic ideal either of you perhaps imagined during your courtship, but it feels, somehow, more solid than that idealized version ever could have. A testament to something sturdier than mere infatuation. A working, evolving partnership built one small reconciliation at a time. It is evening, and the record player hums to life in the corner of the living room, a wedding gift from a favourite uncle. Music fills the small apartment, something soft, something slow, and for a moment you dance in your socks on the carpet, careful not to bump into furniture that still has not found its final place. The needle drops with a soft crackle, that particular hiss of static before the music finds its groove, a sound that will become so familiar in the years ahead that you will barely notice it, but tonight it still feels new, almost ceremonial. Your husband fiddles with the volume knob, turning it just slightly, testing how loud you can play it before a neighbour might complain through the thin apartment walls. You settle on something soft enough to feel intimate but present enough to fill the room, and the first slow song begins to play. filling the small space with warmth. He reaches for your hand almost shyly, an echo of the same gesture he made at your wedding reception just weeks ago, except now there is no crowd watching, no photographer waiting to capture the moment. Just the two of you alone in your half-furnished living room, boxes still stacked against one wall, curtains still borrowed and slightly too short for the windows. You step into his arms easily, your bodies already learning the particular rhythm of moving together, and begin a slow, unhurried sway that has less to do with any formal understanding of dancing and more to do with simply wanting to be close. The record player itself sits proudly on a small table near the window, a handsome wooden cabinet with a shine that has not yet dulled from years of use, still smelling faintly of varnish and cardboard packaging. It was, without question, one of the more generous gifts you received, and you had both agreed, almost immediately upon opening it, that it would occupy a place of honour in the living room, the centrepiece around which future evenings would gather. Tonight, only a few records exist for it, mostly gifts from the wedding, a handful of favourites carried over from your individual single lives, but already you can imagine the collection growing steadily over the years, shelves gradually filling with albums that will mark different seasons of your marriage. You dance slowly around the small clear patch of carpet, careful of the couch's uncertain positioning, careful of the lamp still sitting slightly too close to the walking path. There is something almost comic about dancing in a room this cluttered, and you both acknowledge it with quiet laughter, adjusting your steps to avoid a half-unpacked box, spinning gently to miss the edge of a side table that has not yet found its permanent home. It does not feel like a setback. It feels instead like a small metaphor for the whole of married life so far, imperfect, still finding its shape, but entirely yours. The song ends, and rather than choosing another, you simply stand there for a moment in the settling quiet, your head resting against his chest, listening to his heartbeat beneath the fabric of his shirt. Outside, the evening is fully darkened, streetlights beginning to glow faintly through the thin curtains, and the apartment feels, in this particular moment, entirely complete despite its unfinished state. Music has a way of doing that, filling in the gaps that furniture and unpacked boxes leave behind, creating a sense of home even in rooms that are still visibly under construction. He puts on another record, something with a little more rhythm this time, and you find yourselves laughing as you attempt something closer to actual dancing, missteps and all. His hand occasionally slipping from proper position, your sock nearly catching on the edge of the rug. Neither of you is particularly skilled at this, and it does not matter in the slightest. The point was never precision. The point is simply being here, together, filling your first apartment with music and movement and the particular joy of two people who still feel a little bit like they are getting away with something wonderful. As the evening winds down, you finally sit together on the mismatched couch, slightly breathless, the record still spinning quietly, filling the remaining silence between conversations. You talk about which records you might buy next, whether to invest in something for dancing or something quieter for evenings like reading or simply talking. It is such a small decision, and yet it carries within it the same quiet significance as so many of your other early choices together. The slow, deliberate building of a shared taste, a shared collection, a shared soundtrack to the life you're only beginning to construct. Later, as you finally turn off the record player for the night, the room falling into a different kind of quiet. You glance around at the boxes still waiting to be unpacked, the furniture still finding its proper place, and think that someday, years from now, this evening will likely blur together with countless others like it, Ordinary nights spent dancing in your socks to whatever record happened to be playing. But right now, in this particular moment, it still feels remarkable. This simple ritual of turning an empty apartment into something that finally, unmistakably feels like home. The kitchen is small, barely large enough for two people to move without bumping elbows, but tonight you're both in it, following a recipe clipped from a magazine. Flour dusts the counter. Something simmers on the stove. It is not a perfect meal, not yet, but it is the first one made by two hands instead of one, and that makes it taste like something worth remembering. The recipe card sits propped against the sugar canister, slightly stained already from an earlier attempt at reading it while stirring, the magazine clipping soft at the edges from handling. You had chosen something ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for a first attempt at cooking together, a chicken dish that requires more steps than either of you initially anticipated, but you're both determined to see it through, driven by a stubborn newlywed optimism that assumes competence will simply arrive if you want it badly enough. Your husband stands at the stove, sleeves rolled up, brow furrowed in concentration as he attempts to brown the chicken pieces without either burning them or undercooking them, a delicate balance he has clearly not yet mastered. You work beside him at the counter, measuring flour with more confidence than you actually possess, occasionally glancing over his shoulder to offer unsolicited advice that he accepts with good humour despite having roughly the same level of expertise as you do. Neither of you grew up cooking much beyond simple staples, and this shared inexperience becomes, unexpectedly, one of the evening's small pleasures. Two people fumbling together rather than one person confidently instructing the other. The kitchen fills gradually with the rich smell of chicken browning in butter, mixed with the sharper scent of onions you're attempting to dice with more enthusiasm than skill. Your eyes water slightly from the onions, and he teases you gently about it, though his own eyes are equally affected, both of you blinking through the sting while trying to maintain some semblance of culinary dignity. It occurs to you that this particular kind of small shared discomfort, minor as it is, carries its own strange intimacy, another small hardship endured together rather than alone. Flour dusts across the counter in a fine layer, tracking onto your apron and faintly onto the floor despite your best efforts at containment. You measure and remeasure, uncertain whether the recipe's instructions translate correctly to the smaller quantities you're working with, cooking for two rather than the family of 4 or 6 the magazine clipping seems to assume. This adjustment becomes its own small negotiation, halving measurements, guessing at cooking times, the particular trial and error required when learning to cook not for a crowd, but for a household of exactly 2 people, still learning each other's appetites. The dish, when it finally comes together, does not look quite like the photograph accompanying the recipe. The sauce slightly thinner than intended, the chicken slightly more browned than the picture suggested it should be. But the smell filling your small kitchen is undeniably appetizing, rich and warm, evidence of genuine effort even if the execution falls somewhat short of professional standard. You plate it together at the counter, portioning carefully, proud despite its imperfections, the way any first attempt at something meaningful carries pride regardless of its technical shortcomings. You sit down at your small, slightly wobbly kitchen table, the overhead light casting a warm glow over plates that represent, however modestly, your first genuine collaboration in the kitchen. The first bite is met with careful, diplomatic silence from both of you, each waiting to gauge the other's honest reaction before offering your own assessment. It is, you both eventually agree, not bad, certainly edible, perhaps even good in a rough, unpolished sort of way, evidence of promise rather than mastery. You eat slowly, savouring not just the meal itself, but the accomplishment of having made it together, discussing what you might adjust next time, more seasoning here, a shorter cooking time there, the beginning of what will become, over years of shared meals, an increasingly confident culinary partnership. Tonight, though, it is enough simply to have attempted something together and produced a meal that, whatever its flaws, tastes distinctly of effort and collaboration. As you clear the dishes afterward, the kitchen still slightly dusted with flour, the pots soaking in the sink, you feel a small, genuine satisfaction settling over the evening. This particular kind of domestic labour, cooking together, however imperfectly, will become one of the quiet, recurring rituals of your marriage. Evenings spent shoulder to shoulder at the stove, learning slowly what works and what does not, building a shared repertoire, one attempted recipe at a time. Tonight's dinner may not have been perfect, but it was entirely yours, made by two hands working together for the very first time, and that, you decide, makes it taste like something worth remembering long after the recipe itself has been perfected or abandoned altogether. Let's turn to the coffee can on top of the refrigerator, the one where loose bills and coins collect week after week. It is not much yet, but it represents something larger, a small brick house somewhere down the road, a yard, a mortgage with both your names on it. Saving together feels different than saving alone, slower sometimes, but somehow lighter. The coffee can itself is unremarkable, an empty container from a brand you no longer even purchase, its label slightly faded, repurposed for this particular quiet ritual of setting aside whatever small amount you can each week. Every Friday evening, after groceries have been purchased and bills have been paid, whatever remains gets folded carefully and dropped into the can with a soft, satisfying rustle, a small ceremony that has already become a fixture of your weekly routine despite being only a few weeks old. You climb onto a kitchen chair to retrieve the can sometimes, just to count what has accumulated, spreading the bills and coins across the kitchen table in careful piles, adding up the total with a shared sense of modest accomplishment. It is never a large sum, a few dollars here, sometimes a little more when an unexpected expense does not materialize as predicted, but the running total, however small, represents something neither of you had access to as single people living separately, a shared goal pursued jointly rather than individually. Your husband talks sometimes in the quiet hours after dinner about the kind of house he imagines eventually. Not grand, nothing extravagant, just a modest brick house with a small yard, room enough eventually for children, a place that belongs entirely to the two of you rather than a landlord somewhere across town. You add your own details to this shared imagining, a kitchen with more counter space than your current small apartment allows, perhaps a porch where you might sit together in the evenings the way his parents do at their own home. This shared vision, still years away from becoming reality, gives a particular meaning to the modest ritual of the coffee can, transforming loose change and folded bills into something closer to a physical manifestation of hope. You find yourselves making small sacrifices without much complaint, skipping a movie some weekends, choosing a slightly less expensive cut of meat, redirecting what would have been spent on small pleasures toward this larger shared ambition instead. Neither of you frames these sacrifices as burdensome. They feel instead like investments in something you both genuinely want. Occasionally you supplement the coffee can with a proper savings account at the local bank. The coins and bills eventually exchanged for a small deposit that earns modest interest, evidence of progress that feels more official somehow than the informal system of the kitchen can. You remember the particular pride of walking into the bank together for the first time as a married couple, filling out paperwork with both your names listed side by side, watching the teller record your joint deposit into a passbook that will, over the coming years, slowly document your progress toward home ownership. There is something almost old-fashioned, even by the standards of your own present moment, about this slow, patient method of saving, dollar by dollar, coin by coin, rather than any grander financial strategy. But it suits the particular rhythm of your early married life, this steady, unglamorous accumulation, evidence of shared discipline rather than any dramatic windfall. You imagine sometimes looking back on this coffee can years from now, once you have finally moved into that modest brick house you both dream about, remembering these early days of folding bills into an old coffee container with a mixture of nostalgia and quiet pride. On Friday evenings, after the ritual of adding to the can, you sometimes sit together at the kitchen table with a real estate section clipped from the newspaper, circling listings you cannot yet afford, but enjoy imagining nonetheless, small brick houses in neighbourhoods a short drive from where you currently live, yards described in modest but hopeful terms, front porches perfect for quiet evening conversation. These sessions carry no real urgency, simply a pleasant exercise in shared daydreaming, a way of keeping your eventual goal present and vivid, even while the actual achievement of it remains comfortably distant. The coffee can continues to fill slowly over the weeks, its weight increasing gradually, evidence of patient progress that feels entirely appropriate to the pace of your current life together. It is not much yet, as you both readily acknowledge, but it represents something you are building deliberately, together, dollar by folded dollar, coin by careful coin, toward a modest brick house that exists for now only in careful pencil circles on a newspaper page and in the quiet, hopeful conversations you share over dinner each evening. It is Saturday afternoon, and you're standing in a furniture store debating over a couch neither of you can quite afford but both secretly want. The decision feels bigger than the price tag, a quiet negotiation of taste and compromise, the first of many purchases you will make as a single unit rather than two separate people. The showroom floor stretches out before you, couches arranged in neat groupings meant to suggest imaginary living rooms far more spacious than your own small apartment, each piece tagged with a price that makes you both wince slightly, despite your best efforts at maintaining a casual browsing demeanour. You'd come in simply to look, an innocent Saturday errand, and yet here you are, nearly an hour later, both drawn irresistibly toward the same particular couch, a deep green piece with rolled arms and a texture that feels sturdy beneath your palm when you run your hand across its surface. Your husband sits on it experimentally, testing its firmness, glancing up at you with an expression that suggests he is already imagining evenings spent reading on this particular couch, evenings that do not yet exist but feel suddenly, powerfully possible. You sit beside him, testing the cushions yourself, and find yourself equally drawn to it despite the price tag sitting discreetly on its arm, a number that exceeds what either of you had privately budgeted for this particular purchase. A salesman approaches, sensing an opportunity, offering details about the couch's construction, its durability, the particular quality of its upholstery, all while gently steering you toward the idea that this particular piece represents genuine long-term value, despite its higher initial cost. You exchange a glance with your husband, the particular silent communication that married couples develop quickly, a look that conveys both temptation and financial hesitation simultaneously, without either of you needing to speak a word aloud. You step a few feet away, ostensibly to examine a different piece, but really to have a quiet, private conference about whether this particular indulgence makes practical sense, given your current savings goals, the coffee can on the refrigerator, the modest brick house still years away. Your husband argues, reasonably, that a couch is not a small purchase, that you will likely keep it for years, that perhaps it makes sense to spend slightly more now for something that will last, rather than purchasing something cheaper that might need replacing within a few years anyway. You find yourself largely persuaded by this logic, though you also suspect it is simply the couch itself, its particular comfortable weight and colour, doing most of the persuading beneath the surface of practical justification. Eventually you return to the salesman, ask about payment arrangements, discover that a modest monthly instalment plan exists that would allow you to bring the couch home today while paying the remaining balance over several months. This possibility shifts something in the negotiation, transforming an overwhelming lump sum into something more manageable, and you find yourselves nodding at each other, the silent agreement passing between you that this, finally, is the couch, worth the modest financial stretch it will require. Signing the paperwork feels surprisingly significant, both your names appearing together on the installment agreement, a small but real document of shared financial commitment. It occurs to you, watching your husband's careful signature beside the space where you will add your own, that this is precisely the kind of decision marriage requires constantly. This careful, deliberate balancing of want against practicality. This willingness to stretch slightly further for something you both believe is worth the extra effort. The couch will be delivered the following week, the salesman assures you, and you leave the store with a mixture of excitement and mild financial anxiety, already calculating how the monthly payment will fit alongside rent and groceries and the modest but steady contribution to your coffee can savings. Neither of you regrets the decision, though you both acknowledge, walking back to your car under the bright Saturday sun, that perhaps you should exercise slightly more restraint before making any similarly significant purchases in the near future. That evening, back in your small apartment, you find yourselves discussing the couch with a kind of giddy anticipation, typically reserved for much larger life events, imagining exactly where it will sit, how it will transform the still slightly awkward living room arrangement, what evenings spent together on its cushions might eventually look like. It is, in the grand scheme of things, simply a piece of furniture, but tonight it feels like something more significant, tangible evidence of your shared taste, your shared willingness to compromise, your shared commitment to building, piece by careful piece, a home that reflects both of you equally. Let's step outside for a moment, into the hallway or the small strip of lawn out front, where a neighbour waves and introduces themselves for the first time. Being newlyweds in a new building means being the new couple on the block, the ones other neighbours watch with quiet curiosity, wondering how long the honeymoon glow will last. You're carrying a small bag of groceries up the front walk when a woman from the apartment across the hall steps out onto her own small porch, waving with the particular friendly curiosity reserved for new neighbours, especially newly married ones. She introduces herself warmly, mentioning she noticed the moving truck a few weeks back, offering the kind of welcome that feels genuine even amid its underlying assessment, the neighbourly equivalent of sizing up the new couple to determine what kind of neighbours they might turn out to be. You chat for a few minutes on the front walk, exchanging basic information, how long she's lived in the building, how you and your husband met, the pleasant surface-level conversation that begins most new neighbourly relationships. She mentions, almost in passing, that she and her own husband have lived in the building for nearly 5 years now, long enough to have witnessed several other young couples move in with similar newlywed brightness, some staying for years, others moving on within a season or two toward that eventual brick house every young couple seems to be saving toward. There is something both comforting and slightly self-conscious about being observed this way. The awareness that your own small domestic rituals, groceries carried up the walk, laundry hung to dry, evenings spent with the lights glowing softly through curtained windows, are being quietly witnessed by neighbours who have already lived through their own versions of newlywed life. You find yourself wondering, walking the rest of the way to your apartment door, what conclusions your neighbours might already be forming about your particular marriage based on these small, visible fragments of your daily routine. Over the following weeks, you begin gradually meeting others in the building, an older couple on the ground floor who keep mostly to themselves but always offer a polite nod in passing, a bachelor 2 doors down whose apartment always smells faintly of cigarette smoke and produces music at odd hours, a young mother upstairs whose baby's cries occasionally drift down through the ceiling, offering both of you a small preview of a stage of life still comfortably ahead of you. Each of these neighbours becomes a small, familiar fixture of your daily landscape, faces you begin recognising on the stairwell, names you slowly learn and attach to specific apartments. The building itself develops its own particular rhythm that you are only beginning to learn, which neighbours keep late hours, which mornings the building superintendent comes through to check the boiler, which evenings the hallway fills with the mingled smells of 6 different dinners cooking simultaneously behind closed doors. There is something comforting in this shared domestic ecosystem, the awareness that you are not simply isolated in your own small apartment, but part of a larger, quietly interconnected community of households, each pursuing its own version of ordinary life within the same building's walls. Your neighbour across the hall becomes gradually something closer to an actual friend rather than simply a friendly acquaintance. Occasional conversations in the hallway evolving into brief visits over coffee, an exchange of recipes, small updates about each other's lives that accumulate slowly into genuine familiarity. She offers occasional gentle advice about married life, having navigated her own early years of marriage in this same building years before, advice you receive with genuine appreciation even when you do not fully act upon it. There is a particular comfort, too, in simply being observed and apparently approved of by the broader neighbourhood, small gestures of acceptance accumulating gradually, an invitation to a building-wide gathering, a friendly recommendation for a reliable local butcher, small kindnesses that suggest you're being welcomed not just as strangers, but as a genuine part of this particular small community. You find yourself walking home some evenings, greeting neighbours by name now, waving at the mailman who has learned your names, feeling gradually less like the new couple on the block and more like simply another household among many, each pursuing its own small, ordinary version of domestic life within the same shared building. By the time a few months have passed, the building feels less like an anonymous collection of separate apartments and more like a genuine neighbourhood in miniature, populated by faces you recognise, names you have learned, small kindnesses exchanged regularly across hallways and front walks. It is, you realise, a particular kind of community that modern life, decades later, with its greater privacy and diminished neighbourly familiarity, will rarely replicate quite so easily. This close, almost accidental intimacy, born simply from sharing walls and stairwells with the same small group of people, week after week, season after season. It happens somewhere ordinary, at the dry cleaner, or on the phone with the electric company, someone addressing you as Mrs. for the first time. It catches you off guard, this new name that is both yours and not quite yours yet, a title you are still growing into the way you grow into a new coat. You're standing at the counter of the dry cleaner, dropping off your husband's suit from the wedding, when the clerk glances at the ticket and asks almost automatically whether the name should be listed as Mrs., followed by your husband's surname. The question catches you entirely off guard, a small, unremarkable moment that nonetheless sends something unexpected fluttering through your chest. This quiet, official acknowledgement of your new identity spoken aloud by a complete stranger who has no idea how recently you acquired it. You answer yes, of course, though something in your voice must betray a slight hesitation, because the clerk glances up briefly before returning to her paperwork, apparently unaware of the small internal adjustment she has just prompted. Walking out of the shop, ticket in hand, you find yourself repeating the name quietly under your breath, testing its shape in your mouth. This new identity that legally belongs to you now but still feels, in some essential way, like a coat borrowed from someone else's closet, not quite broken in, not quite comfortable, though undeniably yours to keep. The experience repeats itself over the following days in various small, unremarkable contexts. A telephone operator addressing you formally when you call to establish service, a form at the doctor's office requesting your married name, a letter arriving addressed to Mrs., followed by your husband's full name rather than your own first name, a small but genuine erasure of your individual identity into a shared marital one that catches you slightly off guard each time it happens. You do not resent this change exactly, but you notice it, the particular weight of a new name that arrived not gradually, the way most identities develop, but suddenly, entirely, the moment you signed a marriage certificate. Your husband, you notice, experiences no equivalent shift, his own name remaining precisely as it always was, adding only the small designation of husband to an identity that otherwise remains entirely unchanged. This asymmetry does not particularly trouble you. It is simply the expected order of things in 1970, but you find yourself occasionally aware of it nonetheless. This quiet observation that marriage requires a different kind of adjustment from you than it does from him, at least in this particular small nominal sense. Gradually over the following weeks, the name begins to feel less foreign, less like a borrowed coat, and more like something genuinely your own. You sign it now on various forms and documents with increasing confidence, the letters flowing more naturally from your pen each time, until eventually you can barely recall the particular strangeness of first hearing yourself addressed this way. There is something almost imperceptible about this transition. No single dramatic moment marking the shift from unfamiliar to familiar, simply a gradual accumulation of repetition until the new name feels, finally, indistinguishable from your original one. You think sometimes, in quiet moments, about your own mother's experience of this same transition decades earlier, wondering if she felt the same small, strange displacement when she first became Mrs., rather than simply herself wondering how long it took her to grow fully into a name that arrived all at once rather than gradually. There is something almost sacred about this shared experience across generations of women, this particular, universal adjustment that so many before you have navigated quietly, individually, each in their own small, unremarkable moments at dry cleaners and doctors' offices and telephone company counters. By the time several months have passed, you can barely remember the particular strangeness of that first moment at the dry cleaner counter, the small, startled feeling of hearing yourself addressed by a name that felt only partially yours. It has become, gradually and almost invisibly, simply your name now, worn in fully, comfortable in the way only genuine familiarity can produce. And yet you remember, faintly, fondly, that first small jolt of unfamiliarity, evidence of just how much has changed in these opening months of your marriage, identity itself gradually reshaping around this new shared life you're building together. Let's move ahead to the first holiday season. String lights strung a little crookedly over a first shared mantle, a small tree decorated with ornaments borrowed from both families. It feels different this year, quieter in some ways, fuller in others, the beginning of new traditions built from pieces of old ones. The tree itself is modest, purchased from a lot a few blocks away, slightly smaller than either of your family's trees growing up, but it fits comfortably in the corner of your small living room, filling the apartment with the sharp, resinous smell of fresh pine that neither of you quite anticipated missing until it filled your nostrils again this particular December. You spend an entire evening decorating it together, unpacking a small box of ornaments, some borrowed generously from his mother's extensive collection, others carried carefully from your own childhood home, each one carrying its own small history that you narrate to each other as you hang them among the branches. The string lights prove more troublesome than either of you expected. Tangled from their storage, several bulbs burnt out entirely, requiring patient troubleshooting before the strand finally cooperates enough to wrap around the tree in a reasonably even pattern. You laugh together over the crooked result, the lights bunching more thickly on one side than the other, an imperfection neither of you feels particularly motivated to fix, deciding instead that its slight unevenness gives the tree a kind of homemade charm that a more perfectly arranged tree might lack. This first Christmas carries a particular quality of newness, the awareness that you are establishing traditions now, rather than simply following ones already established by your respective families. You discuss, somewhat seriously for such a small decision, whether to open gifts on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, whose family's tradition to follow, eventually landing on a hybrid approach that borrows elements from both households. Small gifts exchanged on Christmas Eve, the larger ones saved for morning. The apartment feels quieter than either of your childhood homes did during the holidays. No siblings underfoot, no parents managing a larger, more chaotic household gathering, just the two of you navigating this particular season together for the first time. There is something both peaceful and slightly melancholy about this quieter version of the holiday, an awareness that you have traded the familiar chaos of a larger family gatherings for a smaller, more intimate celebration, one that feels emptier in some ways, but also, in its own quiet manner, fuller. You spend an evening baking together, attempting your mother's recipe for holiday cookies with mixed but genuinely enjoyable results. Flour dusting the small kitchen once again, the particular warm smell of cinnamon and sugar filling the apartment alongside the pine scent already established by the tree. The cookies emerge slightly uneven, some overbaked, others not quite finished, but you both eat them anyway, sitting together by the tree's soft glow, genuinely pleased with this small, imperfect contribution to your first shared holiday season. On Christmas morning itself, you wake earlier than necessary, eager despite yourselves, moving to the living room in pyjamas and slippers to exchange the modest gifts you've carefully selected for each other over the preceding weeks. His gift to you, a small piece of jewellery chosen with more care than his shopping abilities usually suggest he possesses, brings genuine tears to your eyes, while your own gift to him, a sturdy leather wallet monogrammed with his initials, earns an equally genuine, if less visibly emotional appreciation. You spend the remainder of Christmas Day dividing your time between both families, a car ride to his parents' house for a late morning visit, followed by dinner at your own parents' home in the evening, a schedule that will likely repeat itself, with occasional variations for many holidays to come. Both visits carry their own particular warmth. Family members delighted to see you both settling into married life, gentle teasing about newlywed happiness, the comfortable, familiar rhythms of larger family gatherings that you had both grown up within. By the time you return to your own small apartment late that evening, the tree's light still glowing softly in the otherwise darkened living room, you feel a particular kind of contentment settling over you both, exhausted from the day's activity, but genuinely happy. This first holiday season, however modest and occasionally imperfect, has established something important, evidence that you can successfully blend traditions from both your families into something distinctly your own, the beginning of what will likely become, over the coming decades, an entirely unique set of holiday customs belonging exclusively to your particular, still quite new, marriage. It is a Friday evening, and old friends have come over for the first time since the wedding, curious to see how married life has settled onto you both. Conversation drifts easily, though you notice small changes, the way you finish each other's sentences now, the way home has come to mean something different than it once did. The apartment has been tidied more carefully than usual in preparation, the couch cushions fluffed, the record player ready with a stack of appropriate albums, a modest spread of snacks arranged on the coffee table that took considerably more effort to prepare than you initially anticipated. Your old friends, a couple you've known since high school, along with a few unmarried friends still navigating their own separate single lives, arrive within minutes of each other, filling the small living room with familiar voices and easy, established affection. There is an immediate warmth to reuniting with old friends after the whirlwind of wedding planning, and the quieter adjustment period that followed, though you notice, almost immediately, subtle shifts in how you interact now compared to before your marriage. Questions arise naturally about apartment life, married routines, how you have settled into your new roles, questions asked with genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness. Your friends eager to understand this new chapter you have entered that they themselves have not yet experienced. Conversation moves easily between old shared memories and newer developments, your friends catching you up on their own lives, jobs and small romantic developments, and various minor dramas that continue unfolding within your broader friend group regardless of your own changed circumstances. You notice partway through the evening that you occasionally finish your husband's sentences now, or he finishes yours, a small habit that has developed without either of you fully noticing until this moment, when it becomes visible against the backdrop of friends who knew you both separately, individually, before this particular merging occurred. One of your unmarried friends teases you gently about this new habit, noting how quickly you seem to have adopted certain married couple mannerisms, finishing each other's thoughts, exchanging quick glances that communicate entire conversations without any words spoken aloud. You laugh along with the teasing, though you also feel a small, private satisfaction at this observation, evidence that whatever adjustment period existed during these opening months of marriage has genuinely produced something real, a partnership visible even to outside observers who knew you both before. The conversation eventually turns toward more substantive territory, questions about how married life differs from what you both expected, whether the adjustment has been difficult, what surprises, pleasant or otherwise, marriage has produced so far. You find yourselves answering honestly, mentioning the first small argument over dishes, the pleasure of cooking together despite modest culinary skills, the particular comfort of building a shared home from mismatched furniture and borrowed ornaments. Your friends listen with genuine interest, some perhaps already imagining their own eventual marriages, others simply curious about a life stage they have not yet reached themselves. As the evening progresses, snacks gradually diminish, records continue playing softly in the background, and conversation eventually settles into the comfortable, meandering rhythm typical of long-time friendships, less structured than earlier in the evening, punctuated by easy laughter and the particular shorthand that develops among people who have known each other for years. You notice, watching your husband engage easily with your own long-time friends, a small wave of gratitude that he fits so naturally into this established friend group, that marriage has not required you to sacrifice these older, cherished relationships, but rather has simply added a new dimension to them. By the time your friends finally depart well into the evening, hugs exchanged at the door along with promises to visit again soon, the apartment falls into a particular kind of comfortable quiet, evidence of a genuinely successful evening rather than mere exhaustion. You and your husband begin the modest task of cleaning up together, gathering empty glasses and half-finished snacks, discussing the evening's conversation with the particular satisfaction that follows a genuinely enjoyable gathering. This first visit from old friends carries its own quiet significance, evidence that your marriage exists not in isolation, but within a broader web of relationships that continue evolving alongside your new life together. Home, you realise, cleaning the last of the dishes as the record player finally falls silent for the night, has indeed come to mean something different now than it once did. No longer simply the house you grew up in, or even your own solitary apartment, but this particular shared space filled tonight with friends and laughter and music that belongs now, unmistakably, to both of you together. Let's slow all the way down here into an ordinary Tuesday evening, dishes drying by the sink, the television humming low in the background, both of you settled into chairs that are slowly becoming your chairs. There is nothing remarkable about this evening, and that you're discovering might be the most remarkable part of all. The dishes sit in the rack beside the sink, water still beading slowly off the last plate. The kitchen otherwise quiet now that dinner has been cleared away and the evening has settled into its familiar shape. You have already, in these few short months, developed particular spots in the living room that belong to each of you, without either of you ever formally claiming them. His chair slightly closer to the radio, yours angled toward the window, where the last of the evening light still filters through the curtains. Neither of you remembers deciding this arrangement. It simply happened. The way so many small habits of marriage seem to establish themselves without conversation or negotiation. The television hums softly in the corner, a variety program neither of you is watching with much real attention, more background presence than actual entertainment, filling the apartment with voices and occasional music while you each attend to your own small evening tasks. You have a magazine open on your lap, though you have read the same paragraph twice without absorbing it, more interested in the particular comfort of simply existing in the same room as your husband than in whatever article you had intended to finish. He sits across from you with a newspaper, sections rearranged from this morning's reading, occasionally reading a line aloud that catches his interest, a habit you have both fallen into without much discussion. There is a particular quality to this kind of evening that neither of you anticipated during your courtship, when every evening together felt like an event requiring effort, a date to prepare for, an occasion to dress for. Now, months into marriage, you find yourselves simply existing together in ordinary clothes, hair slightly mussed from the day, without any particular need to perform interest or excitement. This unremarkable quality you're discovering carries its own quiet value, evidence that you have moved past the performance of courtship into something steadier, less dramatic, but somehow more genuinely comfortable. Outside, the neighbourhood settles into its own evening rhythm, a car passing occasionally on the street below, a neighbour's radio drifting faintly through the thin walls, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday evening in 1970 unfolding identically in countless other apartments throughout the building and beyond. You're neither more nor less remarkable than any other young couple settling into their own living rooms tonight, and there is something oddly comforting in this anonymity, this awareness that you are simply one small household among countless others, each pursuing its own quiet version of ordinary domestic life. The clock on the mantel, still ticking with the same steady rhythm it has maintained since your wedding gifts were first unpacked, marks the slow passage of the evening without either of you feeling any particular urgency to move toward bedtime. You might exchange a few words occasionally, a comment about something in the newspaper, a question about tomorrow's plans, but mostly you simply coexist in comfortable silence, each absorbed in your own small task, aware of the other's presence without requiring constant conversation to feel connected. This particular kind of quiet you are learning feels entirely different from the loneliness you might have associated with silence before marriage. There is no pressure here, no anxiety about filling empty space with conversation, simply the settled comfort of two people who have grown accustomed enough to each other's presence that silence itself has become a form of intimacy rather than distance. You glance up occasionally to find him already looking at you, a small, unremarkable smile passing between you before you both return to your respective reading, no words necessary to communicate the simple contentment of the moment. Eventually, the television program ends, replaced by another equally unremarkable show that neither of you feels particularly invested in watching, and you find yourselves discussing, idly, whether to turn it off entirely or simply let it continue humming in the background while you finish your respective reading. This small, inconsequential decision typifies the particular texture of married life during these ordinary weeknight evenings. Decisions so minor they barely register as decisions at all, simply the accumulated small choices that fill an evening without any particular significance attached to them individually. As the evening finally winds toward its close, newspaper folded and set aside, magazine finally finished despite your earlier distraction, you find yourselves moving naturally toward the bedroom, the particular choreography of turning off lights and locking doors already familiar enough to require no discussion. There is nothing remarkable to report about this particular Tuesday evening, no significant conversation, no notable event, simply two people existing comfortably together in ordinary domestic quiet. And yet, lying in bed afterward, you find yourself appreciating precisely this unremarkable quality, understanding gradually that marriage's deepest comfort lies not in its dramatic moments, but in these countless, quiet, forgettable evenings that accumulate steadily into something larger, sturdier, and quietly precious. It is the middle of the month, and the checkbook sits open on the table, revealing a gap between what was planned and what was spent. Voices stay low but firm as you work through it together, learning the particular choreography of disagreeing about money without letting it become a disagreement about each other. The checkbook ledger is spread open under the kitchen light, columns of figures that do not quite align the way they should, a small discrepancy that has taken nearly 20 minutes of careful recalculation to properly identify. Your husband sits with a pencil, tracing back through recent entries, his brow furrowed in the particular concentration that money matters always seem to provoke in him, while you sit across the table with your own mental tally, fairly certain you know exactly where the discrepancy originated even before he finishes his recalculation. It comes down, eventually, to an unplanned purchase, a new pair of work shoes he needed rather urgently after his old pair finally gave out beyond reasonable repair, an expense that felt necessary in the moment but was never properly recorded in the budget you had carefully worked out together weeks earlier. You point this out not unkindly, but with a note of genuine frustration, aware that this unplanned expense means less available for the coffee, can savings this particular month, a small but real setback to the modest, patient progress you have both been making toward your eventual house. He responds somewhat defensively at first, noting reasonably enough that the shoes were genuinely necessary, that he could hardly continue working in shoes that were falling apart, and you find yourself agreeing with the underlying logic, even while still feeling a small, persistent irritation about the unplanned nature of the expense. Neither of you raises your voice particularly, this disagreement occupying a lower register than your first real argument weeks earlier. But there is a definite tension in the kitchen nonetheless, both of you aware that money disagreements carry a particular weight, distinct from other small marital frictions. You suggest, somewhat pointedly, that perhaps unexpected expenses like this should be discussed together before the purchase happens rather than after, a suggestion that lands with slightly more edge than you intended, prompting him to point out, not unreasonably, that he could hardly wait for a formal household conference while standing in a shoe store with a hole visible through his sole. This particular exchange threatens briefly to escalate into something sharper, both of you feeling slightly unfairly criticised by the other's perspective, before you both seem to recognise simultaneously that this argument, however legitimate its underlying concerns, is not actually about shoes at all. You take a breath, consciously softening your tone, acknowledging that the shoes were indeed necessary, that you're not truly upset about the purchase itself, but rather about feeling slightly blindsided by an expense that disrupted your careful monthly planning. He, in turn, softens his own defensive posture, admitting that he probably should have mentioned the shoe situation earlier in the week, rather than simply making the purchase and hoping it would not significantly disrupt the budget. This mutual softening, arriving after the initial sharper exchange, feels like genuine progress, evidence that you are both learning to recognize when a disagreement risks becoming unnecessarily personal rather than simply practical. You work together more calmly now to adjust the remainder of the month's budget, identifying a few small areas where you might trim spending slightly to compensate for the unexpected shoe purchase. A modest reduction in the following week's grocery budget, perhaps skipping one of the small treats you'd planned for the weekend. This collaborative problem-solving, following the initial friction, feels considerably more productive than the earlier defensive exchange, both of you now working toward the same practical solution, rather than simply defending your individual positions. By the time the checkbook is finally balanced again, the discrepancy fully accounted for and a modest plan established for absorbing this month's unexpected expense, the earlier tension has largely dissolved into something closer to weary, practical partnership. You close the ledger together, and your husband reaches over to squeeze your hand briefly, a small gesture that acknowledges, without requiring further words, that whatever brief friction occurred over the shoes has been resolved satisfactorily enough for both of you to move forward without lingering resentment. This particular disagreement, modest as it was, teaches you something valuable about how money disagreements will likely recur throughout your marriage, not as isolated dramatic conflicts, but as recurring practical negotiations that require both honesty about frustration and a willingness to move quickly past blame toward collaborative solution. You suspect, closing the checkbook and setting it aside for the evening, that this particular pattern, brief friction followed by practical problem solving, followed by genuine resolution, will repeat itself many times throughout the years ahead, an essential skill you're both slowly developing alongside all the other small competencies marriage seems to require. Let's turn to a quieter, tender moment now, a fever, a sore throat. One of you tucked under blankets on the couch while the other moves quietly around the apartment, bringing soup, adjusting pillows, learning what it means to care for someone through more than just the good days. It begins subtly, a slight scratchiness in his throat that he mentions almost in passing over dinner, dismissing it as nothing significant, likely just tiredness from a demanding week at work. By the following morning, however, the scratchiness has developed into something more substantial, his voice noticeably rougher, his forehead warm to the touch when you press your palm gently against it before he leaves for work, warm enough that you insist with more firmness than he initially wants to accept, that he call in sick rather than push through an entire day feeling this poorly. He resists initially, the particular stubbornness of someone unaccustomed to being cared for, admitting itself through gentle protests that he will be fine, that the office genuinely needs him today, protests you gently but firmly override, guiding him back toward the couch with blankets gathered from the bedroom, propping pillows behind his back with a tenderness that surprises you both slightly. This being the first time in your marriage that illness has required this particular kind of attentive care. You spend the morning moving quietly around the apartment, adjusting the volume on the radio to something soft enough not to aggravate his headache, bringing him water and eventually a modest breakfast of toast, though his appetite proves minimal given his scratchy throat. There is something unexpectedly moving about this small domestic role reversal, watching your typically capable husband reduced to a slightly helpless, blanket-wrapped figure on the couch, dependent now on your attention in a way that reveals a different, more vulnerable side of him than you typically encounter during ordinary healthy days. By early afternoon, you decide soup is necessary, and you find yourself standing at the small stove, following your own mother's recipe from memory, chopping vegetables with more care than usual, wanting this particular soup to genuinely help rather than simply exist as a gesture. The apartment fills gradually with the warm, comforting smell of simmering broth, and you find a small satisfaction in this act of care, this tangible evidence that you can attend to someone else's physical well-being in a way that feels genuinely useful rather than merely symbolic. He dozes intermittently throughout the afternoon, and you move quietly during these periods, careful not to wake him, occasionally checking his forehead with the back of your hand to monitor whether his fever seems to be worsening or improving. There is something almost maternal about this particular vigilance, though directed now toward your husband rather than any child, a small preview perhaps of skills you will eventually need for parenthood. This instinct toward gentle, attentive care that seems to emerge naturally when someone you love is suffering, however mildly, from illness. When he wakes fully in the late afternoon, you bring him the soup, settling beside him on the couch while he eats slowly, his voice still rough but slightly improved from the earlier scratchiness. He thanks you quietly, genuine gratitude evident in his tired expression, mentioning that he cannot remember the last time anyone fussed over him quite this attentively during an illness, having lived alone for several years before your marriage, managing his own minor illnesses without anyone else's assistance or attention. This small comment strikes you unexpectedly. This glimpse into his previous solitary life, illness endured alone without anyone bringing soup or adjusting pillows or monitoring his fever with quiet concern. You feel a small wave of tenderness at this realization, understanding more fully what marriage actually offers beyond companionship during good times, this deeper promise of care during vulnerability, illness, and difficulty that neither of you had to navigate alone before finding each other. By evening, his fever has broken slightly, and though he remains tired and his voice still rough, there is a general sense that the worst of the illness has passed. You settle beside him on the couch for the remainder of the evening, the radio humming softly, his head eventually resting against your shoulder as exhaustion finally overtakes him fully. You sit still, careful not to disturb him, feeling a quiet satisfaction in this small, unglamorous act of care, understanding that this particular vigil, however modest, represents something essential about what you have promised each other, presence and attention, not just during celebration, but through illness, discomfort, and vulnerability as well. It is a quiet evening, months in now, and you find yourselves sitting on the porch step or by an open window, looking back at how quickly the apartment has started to feel like home. The furniture has found its place. The habits have softened into routine. The rings no longer feel new on your hands. You sit together on the small porch step, the evening air carrying the particular warmth of early summer, watching the neighbourhood settle gradually into dusk, streetlights flickering on one by one down the block. Neither of you says much at first, simply enjoying the quiet comfort of sitting side by side after dinner, the record player silent for once, the evening unfolding at its own unhurried pace. It occurs to you, watching a neighbour's dog wander past on its evening walk, how quickly these months have passed, how thoroughly your small apartment has transformed from an unfamiliar collection of borrowed furniture into something that feels, now, entirely and comfortably like home. Your husband mentions, almost idly, that he can no longer quite remember which specific pieces of furniture came from which family, the couch and lamp and mismatched dishes having merged so thoroughly into a single cohesive household that their individual origins have become somewhat irrelevant. You find this observation striking, evidence of exactly the kind of quiet transformation that has occurred these past months. Separate lives merging so gradually and thoroughly that the seams between them have become nearly invisible. You think back, sitting together in the softening evening light that first morning after your wedding. The stiff new sheets, the unfamiliar apartment, the particular nervousness of beginning an entirely new life together without quite knowing what it would require. So much has happened since then. Small arguments and their careful resolutions, shared meals cooked with mixed success, holidays navigated together for the first time, illness weathered with tender attention, disagreements over money worked through with growing skill. None of these individual moments felt particularly monumental as they occurred, and yet, considered together now, they have accumulated into something substantial, a genuine partnership built patiently through countless small, ordinary experiences. The rings on both your hands, you notice, glancing down at them in the fading light, no longer feel quite as strange or new as they once did. Worn now comfortably enough that you sometimes forget you're wearing them at all, evidence of just how thoroughly this new identity, married rather than single, has settled into your daily awareness. You remember that particular strangeness of first being addressed as Mrs., the small internal adjustment required, and marvel now at how completely that adjustment has been absorbed into simply who you are. Your husband reaches for your hand as the evening deepens further, an easy, familiar gesture requiring no particular thought or effort, the kind of small physical affection that has become so routine you barely register it consciously anymore, though you would certainly notice its absence. You think about how different this comfortable familiarity feels from the more deliberate, self-conscious affection of your courtship, when every touch felt significant, requiring acknowledgement. Now touch has become simply part of your shared vocabulary, comfortable and unremarkable in the best possible sense. You discuss, briefly, some of the challenges still ahead, continuing to save toward that eventual brick house, navigating whatever future disagreements will inevitably arise, the possibility of children eventually joining your small household. None of these future considerations feel overwhelming tonight. Simply the natural, expected continuation of the partnership you have already begun building so successfully these past several months. You have learned together that marriage requires patient attention to countless small details, but you have also learned that you're both genuinely capable of this patient attention, evidence collected steadily across these early months together. As the evening finally cools and you rise together to head back inside, you pause for a moment at the door, looking back at the darkening street, the familiar shapes of neighbouring houses and porches, the particular texture of this neighbourhood that has become genuinely yours over these past months. There is a quiet satisfaction in this moment of reflection, recognising how thoroughly an unfamiliar life has transformed into something comfortable and secure, built patiently through countless ordinary days rather than any single dramatic transformation. Walking back inside together, the apartment welcoming you with its familiar smells and settled furniture arrangement, you feel a deep, quiet gratitude for these first months of marriage, imperfect and occasionally difficult as they sometimes were, but genuinely solidly good in their cumulative effect. Whatever lies ahead in the years of marriage still to come, you feel confident, sitting together in your now thoroughly familiar living room, that you have built a genuinely sturdy foundation these past months, patient and honest and increasingly comfortable, ready now for whatever comes next. Let's step outside the apartment now, into a car parked at the curb, a folded newspaper page open on the dashboard, several addresses circled in pencil. It has been over a year of coffee and savings and careful budgeting, and finally, tentatively, you're ready to see what a real house, not just a daydream clipped from the classifieds, might actually look like. The real estate agent meets you outside the first house on your list, a modest brick colonial with a small front lawn and a for sale sign planted slightly crooked near the mailbox. She's brisk and friendly, the particular efficient warmth of someone who has shown dozens of young couples through dozens of similar houses, already sensing perhaps the particular mixture of excitement and financial anxiety that newlywed house hunters typically bring with them. You and your husband exchange a glance before stepping out of the car, the same silent communication you've developed over the past year, equal parts hope and caution. The house smells faintly of someone else's cooking, garlic and something sweet baked recently, evidence of a family still living here, boxes not yet packed in the front hall, a child's drawing taped crookedly to the refrigerator that the current owners have not thought to remove before showings. You walk through rooms that are not yet yours but might become yours, imagining, almost involuntarily, where your own furniture might eventually sit, whether the green couch from your apartment might fit against that particular wall, whether the kitchen table might work better near this window or that one. The kitchen is smaller than you hoped, though the agent points out cheerfully that it has been recently updated. New countertops, a stove only a few years old. Your husband runs his hand along the counter thoughtfully, the same careful, assessing gesture he used on the couch in the furniture store over a year ago, and you find yourself smiling slightly at the familiarity of this particular habit, evidence of exactly how well you've learned each other across these past months. Upstairs, 3 modest bedrooms wait, one clearly a child's room currently, decorated in faded wallpaper patterned with small trains, and you and your husband exchange another glance here, quieter this time, both of you privately imagining a future that includes this particular possibility, though neither of you says anything aloud just yet. The agent, sensing perhaps the particular quality of your silence, mentions gently that the neighbourhood has quite a few young families, good schools nearby, small comments that seem calculated, whether consciously or not, to nudge your imagination further toward a future you're only beginning to picture concretely. The house is, ultimately, slightly beyond what your current savings comfortably allow, a fact you discuss quietly in the car afterward, parked outside on the curb while the agent waits patiently a few feet away with her clipboard. You do the arithmetic together, the same careful mental calculation you have practiced monthly with a checkbook these past 12 months, weighing the appeal of the house against the practical reality of your current coffee, savings and modest combined income. You decide, reluctantly, that this particular house, however appealing its brick facade and its train-papered spare bedroom, sits just beyond comfortable reach for now, perhaps something to reconsider in another year, once savings have grown further. There is small disappointment in this realization, though tempered by the genuine satisfaction of having taken this first concrete step, moving beyond newspaper daydreams into actual walkthrough of actual houses. You continue on to a second address that afternoon, a smaller house a few streets over, less immediately charming than the first, but considerably more within your current means. This one feels less like a dream house, and more like a genuinely realistic possibility, modest but sound, a yard slightly smaller but still adequate, a kitchen plain but functional. You walk through more slowly here, less swept up in imagination, and more carefully practical, testing faucets, checking closet space, asking the agent pointed questions about the furnace's age and the roof's condition. By the end of the afternoon, having seen 4 houses total, you sit together in the car outside the last one, comparing notes with the particular seriousness that has become characteristic of how you approach shared decisions now. None of the houses felt perfectly right, though the second one lingers pleasantly in your memory, practical and genuinely within reach, evidence that your year of patient saving has actually produced something real and actionable, rather than merely aspirational. Driving home, the newspaper page still open on the dashboard, several addresses now crossed out entirely, a few others circled with renewed interest for future consideration. You feel a particular kind of tired satisfaction, the productive exhaustion that follows a day of genuine, meaningful effort toward a long-anticipated goal. Your husband mentions, glancing over at you at a stoplight, that seeing actual houses somehow makes the whole enterprise feel more possible than all those months of newspaper circles and coffee can savings ever quite managed to accomplish alone. You agree, watching familiar streets pass by on the drive back to your apartment, the modest but genuinely yours apartment that has served you so well this first year, and think about how strange it will eventually feel to leave it. This small space where so much of your early marriage took shape, for something larger, more permanent, more distinctly your own. That transition still lies somewhere ahead, not quite yet, but closer now, tangibly closer than it felt just this morning before you climbed into the car with a folded newspaper and a modest, hopeful list of addresses. It is a Friday evening, and for the first time since your wedding, you are preparing your apartment to host overnight guests. Your husband's younger brother passing through town on his way to a new job several states away. The couch, purchased on installment just over a year ago, will serve as his bed tonight, and you find yourselves oddly nervous, testing your abilities as hosts in a way that feels different from simply entertaining friends for an evening. You spend the afternoon preparing the apartment with more care than usual. Fresh sheets found for the couch cushions, an extra pillow retrieved from the closet, towels set aside in the bathroom specifically for your guests' use. There is something almost ceremonial about this preparation, the small domestic rituals of hospitality that neither of you has practiced together before, having spent this first year primarily hosting brief evening visits rather than overnight stays that require this additional layer of thoughtful preparation. Your husband's brother arrives just before dinner, tired from a long drive, carrying a single suitcase and the particular easy affection of family who have known each other their whole lives. You watch the two brothers greet each other with genuine warmth, a familiar embrace and immediate easy conversation, and feel a small, pleasant sense of your apartment expanding temporarily to accommodate this additional presence, the quiet, established rhythm of your married life, shifting slightly to make room for a guest. Dinner unfolds around your small kitchen table, slightly crowded now with 3 place settings instead of the usual 2, conversation flowing easily between family stories you've heard before, and new updates about the brother's upcoming job, his hopes, and modest anxieties about this significant life transition. You find yourself listening with genuine interest, learning small details about your husband's childhood through his brother's recollections, stories that add new dimension to a person you already know intimately, but apparently still have much left to discover. After dinner, you make coffee for all 3 of you, settling into the living room where the record player hums quietly in the background, providing a pleasant undercurrent to the continuing conversation. Your husband's brother asks curious questions about married life, how the apartment has come together, whether you have started house hunting yet, questions asked with the particular genuine interest of someone contemplating his own eventual future, still some years away but apparently already on his mind. As the evening deepens, you begin the small task of preparing the couch for sleeping, unfolding an extra blanket, arranging the borrowed pillow just so. Small gestures of hospitality that feel slightly unfamiliar, but genuinely satisfying to perform. There is a particular pleasure in this kind of practical care for a guest, evidence of your apartment's capacity to extend its warmth beyond just the 2 of you who live there daily, welcoming family into this small space you have built together over the past year. You retire to your own bedroom eventually, leaving your guest settled comfortably on the couch, and lie awake for a few minutes afterward, unusually aware of another person's presence in your apartment, the quiet shuffling sounds from the living room as he settles in for the night. It feels strange, but not unpleasant, this temporary expansion of your household, a small preview perhaps of busier, fuller years ahead when children or other guests might regularly occupy this same living room space. The following morning, you wake earlier than usual, eager to prepare a proper breakfast for your guest before his continued journey, moving quietly through the kitchen while your husband and his brother continue sleeping. You find yourself taking particular care with this meal, wanting to demonstrate through simple eggs and toast and coffee the particular warmth and competence you hope defines your still relatively new household. There is something almost performative about this care, though not insincerely so, simply the genuine desire to represent your marriage well to family who matter deeply to your husband. Breakfast unfolds pleasantly, the three of you gathered again around the small kitchen table. Conversation lighter this morning, practical details about the remaining drive ahead, well wishes for the new job and new city awaiting him. You feel a genuine affection for this brother-in-law, still relatively new to your life, but already beginning to feel like family in his own right. Evidence of how marriage expands your world beyond just the two of you into a broader network of relationships you're gradually learning to navigate and cherish. By late morning, his suitcase repacked, goodbyes exchanged with genuine warmth, you and your husband stand together in the doorway watching him drive away toward his new life in a new city. There is a small, wistful quality to this departure, tempered by the practical awareness that you will likely see him again during future holidays and family gatherings. This particular overnight visit simply one small early chapter in what will become, over the years, an ongoing, evolving relationship. Cleaning up afterward, folding the blanket used for the couch, washing the extra dishes from breakfast, you feel a quiet satisfaction in how smoothly this first overnight hosting experience unfolded, evidence that your apartment, however modest, has genuinely become capable of extending warmth and hospitality beyond just the daily life of your marriage. You mention this to your husband as you finish tidying, and he agrees, adding that his brother seemed genuinely happy during his stay, comfortable in a way that suggests your apartment has successfully become, in this first year, not just a home for the two of you, but a welcoming space for family as well. Let's turn to a quieter, more private moment now, a delayed cycle, a private worry shared cautiously between you, neither of you certain yet whether to feel hopeful or anxious about what it might mean. It is a conversation held in whispers at the kitchen table, the particular vulnerability of considering, together, whether your small household of two might soon become three. You notice it first during an ordinary week, nothing dramatic, simply an awareness that your body's usual rhythm has shifted slightly off its expected schedule. You mention it to your husband hesitantly one evening, not wanting to create unnecessary alarm, but equally unable to keep this particular private uncertainty entirely to yourself. He listens carefully, his expression shifting through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, cautious excitement, a flicker of nervousness that mirrors your own. Neither of you quite knows how to feel, caught between genuine excitement at the possibility and a distinct awareness that you had not specifically planned for this particular development quite yet. Still, several months away from the house you've been carefully saving toward, still settling comfortably into married life without having fully discussed timing for children beyond vague, distant intentions. You sit together at the kitchen table that evening, the same table where you wrote your first grocery list, worked through your first budget, discussed your first real argument, now the site of this new, quieter, more private conversation. You discuss carefully what you might do if the possibility becomes confirmed reality. Whether your current apartment could accommodate a child even temporarily, whether your combined income might stretch to cover this additional expense sooner than anticipated, whether the timing, however unplanned, might actually work out reasonably well despite not matching your original careful schedule. Your husband reaches for your hand across the table, his own uncertainty visible but tempered by a genuine, steadying calm that suggests he is trying, deliberately, to offer you reassurance even while privately processing his own complicated mixture of feelings. The following days carry a particular quality of suspended waiting, both of you slightly more attentive to each other than usual, conversations occasionally drifting toward this quiet, private uncertainty before redirecting toward more ordinary topics, neither of you quite ready to dwell too long on speculation before you have any actual confirmation. You find yourself noticing small things differently during this period, glancing occasionally at the spare room that currently holds mostly storage boxes, wondering, almost involuntarily, whether it might eventually need to transform into something else entirely. You visit the doctor eventually, a modest, slightly nervous appointment that your husband insists on accompanying you to, despite the somewhat old-fashioned expectation that such matters remain primarily a woman's private concern. The waiting room feels unusually quiet, both of you sitting close together, hands occasionally finding each other's for brief, reassuring squeezes while you wait for your name to be called. There is a particular intimacy to this shared waiting, evidence of exactly how thoroughly your lives have merged over this past year, facing even private, vulnerable medical uncertainties together rather than separately. The doctor's examination proves, ultimately, less momentous than either of you anticipated, the delayed cycle attributed instead to ordinary stress and the recent adjustment of settling into new patterns after your first year of marriage, nothing more significant than that. You feel a complicated mixture of emotions upon hearing this news, genuine relief certainly, given how unprepared you both still feel for this particular transition, but also, unexpectedly, a small undercurrent of something like disappointment, evidence perhaps that some part of you had already begun quietly to embrace the possibility you had initially approached with such uncertainty. Walking out of the doctor's office together, your husband's arm around your shoulders, you discuss this complicated mixture of feelings honestly, both of you somewhat surprised by the disappointment mixed alongside the relief. This conversation feels different from your earlier private discussions at the kitchen table, less about logistics and practical timing, and more about genuinely examining what you both actually want, beyond your careful original plans, beyond the house still not yet purchased, beyond the timeline you had established together before this particular scare interrupted it. You realize, walking slowly back toward your apartment on this mild afternoon, that this experience, however brief and ultimately without lasting consequence, has revealed something valuable about your shared readiness for parenthood, not a fixed timeline dictated purely by savings account balances and house hunting progress, but something more fluid, more genuinely emotional, evidence that whenever this eventual transition does occur, you will likely approach it with more genuine readiness than either of you initially assumed. That evening, back in your familiar apartment, you sit together on the couch, the same couch that hosted your husband's brother just weeks earlier, and talk more openly than you have before about your actual hopes regarding children, no longer confined strictly to distant future planning, but acknowledged now as something you both genuinely want, perhaps sooner than your original careful timeline suggested. This conversation, prompted unexpectedly by a brief scare that ultimately proved unfounded, feels like a small but genuine turning point, evidence of how even uncertainty and worry can occasionally clarify, rather than complicate, what two people actually want from their shared future together. So that is what it felt like, being newlywed in 1970 America. Stiff new sheets and unfamiliar kitchens, Grocery lists written in two different sets of handwriting, slowly becoming one. A coffee can on top of the refrigerator filling slowly, dollar by folded dollar, with a whole future tucked inside it. Small arguments over dishes, softened by evenings spent dancing in socks on a carpet that had not yet found its shape. There is nothing extraordinary about any single one of these moments. That is exactly the point. Two people learning each other's habits, a meal cooked imperfectly and eaten gratefully anyway. A hand reached across a couch after a hard evening. This is what it actually looked like to build a life, not in some grand cinematic gesture, but in 1,000 small, patient choices made quietly, day after day, by people who never once thought of themselves as remarkable. So tonight, as you settle in, think about the people who once sat at kitchen tables just like that one, working out a budget by lamplight, learning to fold someone else's laundry, waiting up for news that never turned out to be anything more than an ordinary Tuesday. They were not living for a documentary. They were just living, making the coffee, folding the paper, holding a life together with nothing more than attention and care. Maybe tonight you can carry a small piece of that forward, not a grand resolution, just a smaller one. Notice the person beside you a little more closely tomorrow. Let an ordinary evening be enough, without needing it to be anything else. History is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a coffee can and a record player and someone learning, slowly, patiently, how to love another person well. And that has always been enough. Good night.